as we transition over into our next section, we're going to start focusing on the management tactics that are associated with the scenario we just presented. So we're going to kind of go through, like, in the maintain zone, what type of management might you do there? What might not work? And so I'm going to invite our panelists. So we have Brian, who's going to be talking with us again. We will also have Paul and Jane that'll be joining us for this portion of the discussion. First, we're going to focus on the maintain area, which includes your high desirables, low invasive grasses. So when we're what should we be thinking about when we're going about management?
So I'll start off in our systems, and I think this applies kind of more broadly. For us, it's the perennial grasses that really hold things together. So if I'm in that maintain area, I'm going to be one of my main considerations is thinking about what's needed to make sure that those perennial grasses stay strong, that we're managing to favor them with what we do. And in a lot of these systems, what happens if there's something that we can manage, it's livestock grazing. And so I'm going to be looking at livestock grazing in terms of how do we maintain those perennial grasses in the community, and give them an edge. And another kind of top consideration in my mind here would be, in so much of this, we're talking about the sagebrush ecosystem. So in parts of the sagebrush ecosystem that support big sagebrush, there's kind of this balance between the shrub component and the understory, the herbaceous component. And it varies a little bit, in terms of how much shrub is too much, but there does come a point where if all we do is think about the shrubs, then we might lose some of the grasses and forbs in the understory. And so, it's not just thinking about the perennial grasses, but it's that balance between the shrubs and the understory, and is something needed to kind of make sure that balance persists into the future. And I guess I'll throw one more thought out about what I do in the maintain area, and then I'll mute myself and let some of my esteemed colleagues run with it. But I'm going to be watching. We're up there in the maintain, and we're pretty comfortable. We've got a lot of good stuff, but I'm going to be on the lookout for some of the bad stuff showing up. So.
And Paul, when you say be on the lookout, like, how often are you doing this? Is it every year, every few years, kind of when you have time? What would you kind of recommend?
I'd say as you have time. Probably the more the better, but it's gonna depend on many factors, as you all know. Great question, Claire. I can't answer that. Maybe this is a prime time for me to hand off to Jane or Brian.
Well, one of the answers I was going to give with this general question about what to do in that maintain is, the value of monitoring. And in reality, it's when you have time. Ideally, I would say try to do some sort of monitoring every few years. I mean, you're out there on the landscape driving around, so you see stuff like that. You make observations, but I think there's also some value in having maybe a little more structured monitoring system, whether it's, some permanent plots you go out to regularly, every 3 years, whether you're doing some random frame tosses. It could be using some of our geospatial databases to look at trends over time. So that's what I would say in terms of kind of the monitoring. And then I think in addition to taking care of the vegetation that's out there, which Paul has talked about, I think it's also important to think about staying clean and doing those, paying attention to those preventative measures that we take, like using clean hay if you have to bring hay in, right? Or if you do bring hay in, like feeding it all in one place so you can go back to that area and monitor it post hay use, paying particular attention to any roadways that are passing through the area. That's probably where a weedy species is going to show up first. And then my last response to this idea of what do you do in the maintain is like, it could be keep doing what you're doing. You're like, you're doing things right here. So keep doing that, stay the course.
We use the word maintain. That suggests to me that the characteristics of those sites, plant community characteristics, are meeting our management objectives. Right? I think if we're going to maintain what is there. So there's some assumptions that are built into that. Like it doesn't necessarily mean there is no annual grasses in there at all, but that those annual grasses are below some level that would trigger us to potentially move into an active suppression or control project. And that then things start to get complicated then, like how much is too much, how little are you comfortable with? And I think that goes back into some of those broader discussions we were talking about before. And I really like the discussion of monitoring in that it gives us an idea of trend and movement of that plant community and not just that static look. Like if our annual grasses are steadily increasing through time in a maintain area, even at a low level, then it might increase our sense of urgency to take some action on those sites. So I think that monitoring and then thinking through the trajectory of the vegetation is absolutely critical in those maintain areas. The prevention, fully on board with that. We're not really good at it. Prevention, especially when animals start moving things around. It seems like prevention is hard. And so I guess we haven't specifically talked about early detection, rapid response type approaches. If we think about it spatially, you might have some small areas within your big maintain area that you might take some immediate action on if they start to show trends in the negative direction. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking about that wrong.
Oh, I think your point's well taken, and the comments I had about that balance between the herbaceous and the shrub component. I mean, that's one thing that really does actually kind of worry me, kind of across the sagebrush biome is if one of the problems we can run into if we take too static of a view. We might have a nice balance or an acceptable balance of the shrub and herbaceous component right now and for some number of years, but eventually we might, the window might close on us to do something to maintain not the static plant community, but maintain our options to manage for a variety of plant communities. And so, a number of times in conversations that we've been in, we come up with this idea of the shifting mosaic. In these sagebrush grasslands, there's a lot of value in having parts of that mosaic be actually free of shrubs after something that took the shrubs out, and you've got a dominance of herbaceous plants. Another part of the mosaic has shrubs coming back in with those herbaceous. Another part of the mosaic has more shrubs and less herbaceous. But if there's a danger in sticking to too much of a static view of these plant communities. So I think you're spot on, Ryan.
All right, that negative unintended consequences of good intention thing is something to wrestle with too. I mean, we want to conserve all the shrubs we can, and then we get too much sagebrush where we start to lose the understory. I think that's important to think about. I mean, you can't just be paralyzed and not do anything because it may lead to negative end results.
while we're thinking about monitoring a little bit too, and kind of building on the portion right after lunch where we were talking about susceptibility to invasion. You know, monitoring takes time, and you maybe can't do it everywhere or every year. So I think you could use those susceptibility, any information you have on portions of the landscape within a maintained area that are perhaps more susceptible to invasion. And, you know, that would be, you could prioritize monitoring in those areas too. So there's kind of these different levels or scales of prioritization that you could be doing with these different management efforts, even in an area where you're maintaining.
Jane, do you think potential disturbances or planned disturbances in some of those areas might also kind of fit into that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Planned or unplanned, right? And I think we'll get into some of that a little bit later, like what happens when an unexpected disturbance comes through your landscape. Um, yeah, I mean, these annual grasses love disturbance, and that's gonna be where they capitalize and show up first. So planned or unplanned, yeah, prioritizing those areas of disturbance.
Shifting from the maintain, we're now going to go into the improved section and the different types of management tactics that we might be using during this time. Now, I just want to kind of point out that some of these a lot of these management tactics can overlap from section to section. It is not a like here you only do specifically this, and that there's kind of lines drawn in the sand. So who would like to take it away first?
Well, I'll just kick us off, and I'm basing this answer on, like, as an extension specialist, like, what do I get the most questions about, right? And I think that aligns with what we saw as people were registering for this webinar. I mean, I think this improve area is really a place where, like, well-timed and well thought out herbicide applications are probably the first tool that somebody is going to use. These would be areas that have fairly high recovery potential. And we can be pretty darn selective for annual grasses with our herbicide applications, whether it's indaziflam or another herbicide that would be applied post-emergent in the fall. So I'd just kick us off by saying that, I mean, it's more complex than that, right? And there are other tools here which we'll also discuss, but it seems like, you know, the first thing that pops into my head in this part of our graphic there is the value of a well-timed and a well-applied herbicide application.
Excellent start. Thanks, Jane. I agree. And I'm going to use your approach to open up some more of the grazing management questions. So one of the questions that comes up with respect to grazing management and in invasive annual grasses is, can you graze your way out of the invasive annual grass problem? Well, of course, that depends on how you define the problem, what actually is the problem. But I'm going to just throw that caveat out there, and then I'm going to follow up with a general answer that I think is pretty true. If you're assuming that the problem is presence of invasive annual grasses, then no, you can't graze your way out of that, but you can probably graze in such a way to make invasive annual grasses less of a problem. And you do that by, at the same time, you think about how can you manage livestock grazing to exploit the weaknesses of the invasive annual grass or grasses that you're dealing with, and then do the same thing I said in the maintain areas, and that is to favor the plants you want to keep in the community or those that you want to increase. So I think everybody got an assignment to watch the level 1 videos from last year's webinar, and those of you who did, you get a gold star, and you'll remember that there was quite a message relative to grazing management, that it's not an on-off switch. And in other words, grazed versus ungrazed will only get you so far, and it's not very far. So there are lots of different ways that grazing can happen. And even though it's pretty widely accepted that livestock grazing played a pretty large role historically in helping invasive annual grasses spread and achieve dominance, just taking livestock out of the picture isn't going to fix our problems. So it's much more important to think about the primary considerations of livestock grazing management, and those are the season of use, the duration of use, and also the intensity of use. And those things can vary a lot. And you think about those primary factors relative to the plants in the areas where you're managing in order to, exploit the weaknesses of the invasive annual grasses and increase or at least favor the plants that you want to keep in the community.
Paul, in getting ready for today, I have a bunch of these old sort of historical papers related to annual grasses that I like to go back through and look at repeatedly. You'd think I'd have some of them memorized by now. But in some of that work in like the 70s and 80s from like Evans and Young, like that group in Nevada that was doing so much focus on this, there's several instances where they say that complete removal of grazing might actually exacerbate the annual grass problem now in some of those areas. And it related back to that litter dynamic that we were talking about before. Some of those Great Basin type bunch grass communities would not may not necessarily have a whole bunch of litter in those interspaces without annual grasses that then facilitate themselves by having more and more litter. And so it was pretty interesting. I think listening to both of you, selectivity of whatever it is seems to be like the key, one of, at least not, if not the, it seems to be one of the key concepts for improve areas. We want something that's going to negatively affect our target annual grasses and minimally or not affect the desirable plants that we want to have there. And I mean, that can be, you can affect selectivity of grazing by time and intensity and duration. You can use different herbicides. You can, chemical selection can change your selectivity, timing of application, rates. I think that's one of the things that really is applicable to these improve type situations is there's enough good guys there that whatever we do, we have to make sure that we're enhancing those good guys and negatively affecting the bad guys. That's also the biggest region on that graph. If you notice that, like there's a lot of variability in improve. So it might just be some of those places within the landscape. I mean, especially if we're talking about cheatgrass or Japanese brome, you might just incorporate it into your grazing plan somehow and plan to get a little bit of that forage out when you can and then adjust it. I mean, your goal might not necessarily be, I am going to completely try with intent, try to take cheatgrass down to near zero. Right? You might incorporate it into your management plan to some extent. I do feel like it gives us the most opportunity to make an active difference in those improve areas to actually get out there and do some things.
And I wanted to mention too, building off of what Brian said, of in your packet of handouts, he talked about timing, stuff like that. You can see in the one life cycle diagram about when might be a good time to apply all these different types of herbicide, and kind of give some of those descriptions as well. So if you have questions on that, we tried to answer that in the handout packet as well.
Just in case people don't have it readily accessible. Because I want to mention that grazing is included on that diagram. And while you're doing that, Paul, I was gonna ask you, because I suspect that some of our participants would have a question similar to this. If you were gonna give someone a prescription for grazing, like within this area of improvement, like graze this time of year, give us some sense of the intensity and the duration in order to move the plant community in a direction of improvement. So, attacking the annual grasses, but still protecting the good stuff that's out there. Can you give us a sense of what that would be?
I'll start general, and I'll start here kind of close to home for me. So I'm based in Elko, Nevada, northeastern Nevada, and we've had folks here involved in various projects with grazing management for these reasons, and that is to try to exploit the invasive annual grasses and favor the perennials. And I think, and Jane correctly mentioned earlier that when it comes to grazing, and again, this is really driven by what we've learned with cheatgrass more than any of the other invasive annual grasses. So just be aware of that. But the spring grazing and the dormant season grazing are really our two windows to graze to try and exploit some weaknesses of the invasive annual grasses. So I'll start with spring. That is a time when it's, relatively speaking, it's easier to get the animals to graze on cheatgrass because you've got the new lush growth. But it is also a time when some of our native perennials are getting started as well. And so what we really need to think about there is between the duration and the intensity that we allow those perennial plants an opportunity to grow or regrow after being grazed while the temperatures are still appropriate to support plant growth and while there's enough soil moisture to support plant growth. And so in the springtime, you can hit the invasive annual grasses, but you need to be thinking about the windows of the growth on the perennials in your area and be sure you give them a chance to do their thing before it gets too hot and dry. Okay, so a lot of this is going to be in the uplands, so we're not talking about riparian areas and wetlands. Now, the springtime in our country is kind of hard logistically for livestock managers to hit that window. It's again, Jane correctly said this can be a fairly short window. We're trying to hit it before the cheatgrass turns that red or purple and sets seed. This could be a pretty short window. We don't usually know exactly when that's going to happen. So the logistics of getting the number of animals you need to get to a specific area to hit that short window and have water and all that stuff can be very tough to hit, especially in my neck of the woods here. And so more people are kind of interested in the dormant season grazing, which goes back to what Brian said earlier, and I think maybe Jane too. A lot of these annual grasses are favored by that thatch layer. So you get a whole bunch of biomass produced, and then towards the end of the year, it ends up laying over, lodging, snow pushes it down, whatever, gravity pushes it down, and it makes this nice little habitat that favors seedlings of those invasive annual grasses. And so there is an opportunity to exploit the weaknesses of these invasive annual grasses by removing that thatch layer with dormant season grazing. And logistically, this is something that's much more reliable. During the growing season how much invasive annual grass growth there was that year. So going into fall and winter, you kind of know what's out there for grazing managers to plan on. If you had the growth, the dormant season is coming every year. So it's not like having to get cows from clear over here to clear over there in a very short period of time that you don't know what's going to happen. You do need to make sure there's water available. And for the dormant season grazing, on these invasive annual grasses, you typically need some kind of supplement, at least protein supplement for the animals. But going back to, part of Jane's question is, well, what does that mean for the perennial grasses that are there? Well, the dormant season is a pretty good time. If we go back to thinking about providing the grasses an opportunity to grow or regrow, if you're leaving alone during the growing season for a given area and you're coming in the dormant season, they kind of have the full growing season to put their green leaves up, turn the sun's energy into carbohydrates that is plant food, and do their thing. And as long as you don't hit the intensity really hard to the point where you're exposing the crowns of the plants to desiccation, so drying out, or really extremely cold temperatures, those plants should do pretty well. So that's kind of a general way of answering your question, avoiding, a fixed time period, a calendar date, and a percent intensity. But hopefully that helps.
That litter piece too. Sorry, Jane, I didn't mean to jump. The grazing and the litter piece also makes me think about how it interacts with herbicide, not just in Dazaflam. If we're trying to get some of our pre-emergent active herbicides to the soil surface, and we're trying to push it through a giant thatch layer, there's some good data from Colorado State that shows a lot of those chemicals bind up in that thatch and that litter that's there. And so if we're applying at a pre-emergent timing and we don't get sufficient rainfall within like a pretty short period of time following that application, maybe within a week or two, we're not going to get a lot of that to the soil surface. And so we're effectively applying, we're getting less active ingredient to where it needs to be in the soil than we think we would be with a normal application. And so grazing prior to a treatment might be one way to open that canopy up a little bit.
But I just wanted to mention that, we've talked a lot about grazing and we've focused a lot on cheatgrass. Grazing, and Brian and Paul, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but grazing as a management option is a little less viable, I guess, if you're dealing with Medusa head or ventinata. So I just want to point that out to folks. We've really focused on cheatgrass. That's what many of us are dealing with. But it's a little different conversation with those two species. And then another thing that I don't think we've really mentioned yet, we're talking about these management tactics, is that, our main goal here is to keep these plants from producing seeds, right? Because they rely on seed production to be here from one year to the next, and then trying to wear out or deplete that seed bank. And I would say if annual grasses have an Achilles heel, it's the fact that their seeds don't live that long, relatively speaking, relative to some of our native species, relative to some of the other invasive plants we deal with in sagebrush grasslands. So we need to be continuing to focus on that seed production and seed bank depletion.
Oh yeah, are there life cycle and control opportunity charts for the Medusa head and others that are similar to cheatgrass? So that diagram that I showed that we had up, it is pretty similar to the other invasive annual grasses, so you can apply it to it. There just might be some slight differences, which I believe is timing, but I wanted to open it up to our panel to add any details that they think would be pertinent.
Yeah, I would say in general, it's pretty darn similar. Those two grasses, their phenology is a little different than cheatgrass and even Japanese brome. They're going to mature and senesce a little bit later. Maybe emerge a little bit later. I feel like I've seen that with ventinata in Montana, that you'll see the seedlings later in the fall than you will cheatgrass and Japanese brome. But in general, all of these grasses are winter annuals. And, they're going to come up in the fall, overwinter as those seedlings, and then resume their growth again in the spring.
right?
You might de-emphasize some of the grazing parts of that for Ventnot and Medusa head too. Sorry, Paul, if that's what you were going to say.
Yeah, that's where I was headed. No apology needed. Um, there's some folks, at least in California and maybe elsewhere, that have been having some decent luck getting livestock to graze Medusa head early. So the kind of the spring use. But boy, when it gets mature, it's a little different with those high silica long awns that jab critters in the eyes and up the nose and things like that. And then Ventonata, we just don't know that much about it yet. I mean, one of my colleagues here at UNR has worked with it as much as or maybe more than others, and she's pretty well convinced that we're going to be pretty limited in our options to graze on Ventonata. So grazing restrictions on indaziflam, and okay, so there was, and this would apply. We were starting to talk about using herbicides and grazing together. Brian mentioned, and Jane both, about some potential advantages there. There are no grazing restrictions on indaziflam. That being said, they do kind of recommend that keep in mind that the product needs to get down into the surface layer of the soil, and so they recommend not grazing right after application if it looks like it's going to affect the ability of that product to get down into the soil. It totally makes sense to me. This would be a bigger issue if you have a high probability that a large percentage of the treated area would see a hoof or feel a hoof. A lot of our rangeland settings, that's not the case. We have low animal densities. And so you probably have a very small percentage of the total treated area that would have a hoof land upon it. So I'd have you keep that in mind. But it is if you are working with a high density of animals in small areas, then it would be more and more of an issue, because you may impede the ability of that product to get down into the surface layer of soil where it needs to be.
One thing that's different for Medusa head that we have not touched upon yet, and this is on page 17 of the packet that everybody received, is there you can apply, there's been evidence that an application of aminopyrrolid, so a product like Milestone, to Medusa head in at that stage when it's kind of starting to flower and produce seeds. So that'd be like late, what I think we have it kind of a late spring, early summer. You can actually sterilize seeds. Like you can keep the plant. It's a growth regulator herbicide. It actually keeps the plants from producing full viable seed. So that would be kind of a unique situation for Medusa head in terms of chemical control.
Yeah, and Jane, we followed up on some of that with Ventonata and Japanese brome a couple different years, and we were able to reduce viability quite a bit, but not to the extent that some of that data around Medusa head was.
Yeah, Medusa seems to work particularly well with Medusa head. So from a management recommendation, it's an option for Medusa head, but at this point in time, we don't have data that suggests it's going to work on the other annual grasses.
So our last little section is going to be our contain, restore, and accept. And so we've talked a lot about a lot of different management practices, but I do feel like this is where we do see kind of a big shift in what we might be doing, because we're probably going closer to restoration. So if we want to speak a little bit on that, I'll let you guys take it away.
I could take the easy one if there's three different things, except just learn how to manage it in the way that it is. I mean, there's a lot of discussion around sort of just saying, hey, it's a novel ecosystem. We're just going to get out of it what we can. Hopefully that's not where we end up on a lot of this. That's probably realistic in some parts of the country, is that we just sort of decide that we're going to have to live with it for now. I touched on that a little bit earlier.
I'll take a shot at the restore. This would be a setting where it's the annual grass monoculture that Brian referenced at the beginning of the webinar, or somewhere during this day. And this is where you're looking at like full on, maybe like fire to reduce the litter, herbicide applications to control the emerging seedlings, perhaps control the seed bank to some extent, and then seeding with desired species. In some regards, this is a kind of an easy place to work because you don't have to worry about being selective with your management. You know, we moved out of the improve area where you have both good guys and bad guys. Here it's just bad guys, and you could even use something like a prescribed fire and then a glyphosate application, you know, a non-selective herbicide. It's challenging. I mean, you can do everything right, apply the tools at all the right times, and it's very difficult to get seeded species established in semi-arid environment, which most of us are working in the western half of the country. So you have to have a little help from Mother Nature. You know, the precipitation has to come at the right time. So I love working in this area because I think revegetation is fun, but I will say that a lot of times I'm disappointed in the research plots that I have put out. I will also say that sometimes I'm initially disappointed, but 3, 5, 10 years later, my gosh, it really, like, it looks great out there. So you also have to be super patient. The last thing I will say in kind of this area of the diagram is we've talked a lot about indaziflam and its use on annual grasses. If you're in a scenario where you need to seed, indaziflam is not the herbicide to use. The label says you need to wait 2 years or 24 months before you can seed into it. The research is indicating it's longer, maybe 3 years. So it's a very active area of research because we are trying to think about how this very powerful herbicide can also play a role in restoration or revegetation of annual grass infested sagebrush grasslands. But right now, the safest thing to do is if you're in a scenario where you know you're going to have to seed, opt for a different herbicide, whether it's post-emergent herbicide like imazapic or rimsulfuron or sulfosulfuron or even glyphosate. You know, you're looking at that as part of your toolbox instead of indaziflam.
Another word, contain. So targeted grazing. I mean, fuel breaks. So if, you know, there's a high likelihood if you've got areas that are down in that bottom right corner of the diagram, you've got a lot of fine fuel and a pretty continuous cover of fine fuel. And so doing something for a fuel break to prevent that from burning, you know, if something starts there, to prevent a fire from burning fast right through that and then ripping out through your improve area, a fuel break might be a good thing to consider. And you can do fuel breaks mechanically, you can do them with herbicides, you can do them with targeted grazing. So, you know, back to some of the things we said about spring and fall grazing on invasive annual grasses would come into play, especially if you're thinking about fuel breaks. There's a little bit of a question about, well, it's probably more than a little bit of a question. If you do dormant season grazing, you don't really know. We don't have good hard numbers to say you will definitely reduce the fuel by this much if you conduct a dormant season graze and you reduce the seedling germination and establishment the following year. So we don't know. The most direct way to reduce that fuel is with the spring grazing, because you've got the amount of biomass that's there right before that year's fire season, and to take it down right before fire season, that's the most direct probably result you can hope for. But I would leave the door cracked a little bit that dormant season grazing might help. We just don't know.
Yeah, this is like there's this old concept that the valor of a warrior is determined by his foe, and and like this restoration, that's like the hardest nut for anybody to crack when we're doing with all this. That's why I think we're all drawn to it. We're problem solvers, right? We like to fix things. We go back to like the relative spatial distribution of these states next to one another on the landscape, and you may have places where it makes a lot of sense to engage in either these fuel breaks or very active containment. Paul, I mean, if you got, this is probably an extreme example, but if you got 400,000 acres of a near cheatgrass monoculture and you're expecting to do restoration on the whole thing, that probably doesn't make sense. Or you have, not that this would ever happen, but you have some regulations that say you have a disturbed oil and gas site within a giant sea of cheatgrass, and you have to meet some kind of standards of reclamation on that oil and gas site that's surrounded by a giant sea of cheatgrass, then you would apply some of the same principles that we're talking about, but your probability of success on those sites is going to be lower. I guess the flip side to that would be very particular about chances for contamination on some of these sites. You know, if you did a great job controlling cheatgrass on a restoration project, and then you end up using native grass seed that has cheatgrass seed in it, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot a little bit, and that happens sometimes. And so apply those sort of best management practices related to restoration or reclamation, if you will, on these projects, and I think any of the efforts that you do are gonna benefit from it. I mean, maybe I don't need to point it out to that level, but let's not forget about some of those sort of basic things that we should be thinking about.
Let's also think too, in some of these areas that they're that degraded, right? That we're looking at full-fledged restoration. I think there's an opportunity there to think about seeding introduced perennial species instead of native. There's a large body of research and just anecdotal evidence that it's easier to get introduced species established than it is the native species. So, you know, depending on what the management goals are, I think it's an important consideration. And one thing I like about that is we're at least reestablishing perennial vegetation, right? Which is, you know, there's difference in the rooting structure, there's difference in how long it stays green into the summer. So if you think about wildfire risk, you know, there's the potential to lessen that. So I think these would be areas where, again, depending on the unique situation that you're working within, considerations for seeding introduced species.
Yeah, and I might just chime in here. The Nevada Department of Wildlife, you know, they have been pretty active, and they've got some areas that match what Jane's talking about. They don't really have the option to just leave it, and you know, they recognize that getting natives established everywhere isn't necessarily going to happen. And so, I mean, there have been some pretty successful efforts that are improving habitat or protecting some habitat that hasn't transitioned to, you know, a whole bunch of invasive annual grasses by using some of the introduced species. So we know it's not, you know, not everybody can do it everywhere on all land ownerships, but yeah, it's a good point to bring up.
Man, Paul, you are selling that level 2 in June. So if
I
you
am.
guys see more of that, touch it, taste it, feel it, do whatever you need to do with some of these sites, please consider coming and joining us in Northern Nevada in June.
Yeah, absolutely. And to throw some kudos to one of our core team members, Jordan Spock. He really got us going towards defend your core, not just the core. So, another teaser for the June workshops, that these local groups kind of define what's important and then end up defending what they value and define as their core. So thanks, Brian.
Alrighty, I think we're gonna kind of switch gears for our last little portion of the management section. And so we're gonna focus on what to expect when the unexpected happens. So I'm gonna turn it over to Brian to share his screen.
Let's chat. So what do we do when something unexpected happens? We talked about this a little bit earlier. We had that plan, right? We had our map laid out. We had planned for every acre. We were talking specifically about cheatgrass and in our planning scenario. So our first curveball scenario is we've already had our big management plan. Oh, but then what happens when the first ventonata shows up in your entire 250,000 acre watershed? It's somebody, let's see, Jeremy just came from a bird hunting expedition in Eastern Oregon or somewhere, and his dog just happened to have ventonata seeds on its little jacket thing that some of those dogs wear. And you've got ventonata in your watershed all of a sudden. Does this change your plan at all? What do we do?
I'll start off, and I'll go back to one of the early questions is about, identifying grasses. The only reason we knew we had ventonata is because Jeremy had his hand lens. And if you look at that really good identification sheet in the handout, you'll notice that those pictures are zoomed in. Those structures, the characteristics on grasses are small. So Jeremy, being the good range scientist he had his hand lens, 10 power magnification. He was able to zoom in on some of those characteristics and identify that it was ventonata. So, a lot of people struggle with the grass. One of the biggest things you can do to help you out is get a hand lens, magnify those little structures.
You guys are being nice. I would have uninvited Jeremy from ever hunting in my watershed again. But yeah, what I think about here is some of the rock star groups that I've encountered around the biome, and how important it is to have a good partnership and a nimble partnership. I think the ones that are really successful, they're all friends. They're beyond work colleagues. Like they hang out together. They have a vision, a shared vision of what they want, and they're able to deal with new emergencies without losing sight of the bigger picture. And so I think there's a lot to that group dynamic that allows you to be nimble to say, well, we have a plan, but we don't want to miss an opportunity to catch this early. And so we're kind of try to do two things at once here, and they're capable of doing it.
I would mention that I would first get confirmation that it truly is ventonata. I would talk to folks and the landowner to try to identify how they think it might have occurred there. What's the land management history, just to help better inform where else it might be. If it's right on a road or it's at the trailhead of a parking spot, it's where some hay was dumped, whatever, those pieces could then help highlight where else it might be, so that you could get out and look to see where else it might be, so that then you could prioritize, if you do find other areas, then which one needs to be dealt with first. If it is just this only one, I still would be then highly considering some use of potential chemical, just because that's the cheapest, fastest, easiest way to address a small invasion versus a smaller invasion cost of herbicide. But I also would look at it's ventonata. I mean, it is in a maintained area, so it probably is in a good shape. I'm assuming it's in good shape. There's good perennials there. Sometimes we don't want to disturb an area with additional management actions to make it worse. So you have to be cognizant of that kind of thing. But with it being Ventonata, I would probably want to get in there and get something going on it.
Honestly, I'd be kind of torn. What Lindy just said makes a heck of a lot of sense. But I'd be torn between just getting out to this site and getting it treated. I know about it. It's there. I would treat it pretty quick, maybe even before scouting for other areas. I mean, this is a bird in the hand. So I would struggle. That's my message.
Paul says, "Send up the helicopters." I think I'm with him on this one, but I do so. I'd say maybe you could count it as a victory a little bit because your monitoring or your surveillance program has found it, right? You haven't just been riding over it for 20 years, not knowing what it was. So good to go back to that. Maybe you reinvigorate and recommit to some monitoring in nearby areas or places that may be linked with dispersal pathways. I guess I could devil's advocate a little bit. Are we worried about being aggressive because this is a maintained area that has a bunch of good guys that we want to be in there?
I think there's a high sense of urgency. I mean, I've never seen a invasive plant spread as quickly as I've seen Ventonata. And that's been consistent in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. As a plant ecologist who thinks about invasion a lot, you always read these things in the textbooks and you see the invasion curve and whatnot. But I feel like I witnessed it with Ventonata. I think also, what we've seen is it tends to spread really quickly. And then I think because we haven't recognized any forage value yet, like grazing it is off the table. So I think it presents that additional very important impact beyond what the other annual grasses do.
Josh has a great question.
Yeah, I saw that. I was going to talk a little bit about personal experience. I mean, Jane was talking about the rate of spread. We went in the northeast corner of Wyoming to thinking we had no Ventonata in 2016. And so now, 9 years later, I think we may cross over 250,000 acres worth of Ventonata treatments. And some of that was spread of awareness. Some of it is biological spread. I mean, I agree. It spreads faster than anything I've ever seen. Josh, a direct answer to your question. When we first started doing our Ventonata work in Northeast Wyoming with our cooperative working group, we were spraying patches and I mean, if this were smaller, we were spraying like truck-sized patches or a basketball court-sized patch. And then we would put like 100-yard buffer around it. And then we would come back the next year and it would look like a giant donut of Ventonata. Like there would be Ventonata all around the place that got treated. And there would be a hole where we treated where it was controlled. And it seems to really spread along wildlife and livestock trails, cow trails. And then it seems to move out very quickly from those, almost to the point that 3 or 4 years after initial sort of identification in a pasture, at least in our area, in sort of the transitional northern Great Plains area, that whole pasture is covered. And so I would, whatever you think the right buffer is, maybe it's not big enough. So a common practice for some of the cost share programs in our area is if it's in a pasture sufficient to warrant treatment, they're basically just treating the whole pasture and not trying to piece it out. Oh, another unexpected event that sometimes happens. We had a giant wildfire year in Northeast Wyoming last year. I mean, really like a record year for us. So we had this great plan put in place, team. What does this do? What do we think about? We already had things lined out. We had even identified some of those key areas that we wanted to focus. Does this change anything?
This is my worst nightmare. This is what I live with, and Paul does too. If you're in the Great Basin, we're constantly chasing our tail because all of your staff and all of your time now just got pulled onto responding to a crisis. But I had an aha moment this year at SRM. We were sitting in a room working on this kind of concept and developing plans like we're doing today. And I realized, you know what? I don't think I would have done a darn thing different in my management plan if I had done all of the planning we did today before the fire. I would already have most of my plan in place. And the only thing that's really changing is like how severe was the fire, you know? Um, because that could affect your perennial plants and and maybe your wildlife important browse, you're going to be like replanting shrubs in certain areas, but for the most part, you'll have known the understory condition, you'll know the amount of annual perennial component. So most of what you're going to want to do is pretty similar post fire if you did that planning ahead of time. So I actually feel like we have a pretty good recipe here to have plans on the shelf for inevitable fire. And then maybe we'll be able to react less in a crisis mode and more like we're prepared for this. We know what to do now. And it's just a matter of where do we do what.
And then I would just add, I hope the plan kind of accounts for different plant communities in the area. So if this is the lower resistance, lower resilience type of habitat, I would imagine we'd be reading in the plan that we would shift some priorities to prevent this from burning a second time. Because a lot of, I know a lot of this was in the maintain, and so it hadn't burned twice in a short period of time already. This is kind of the first burn. And we know that if we get very much fire in these systems, we're going to see a lot more of the yellow. So yeah, I think what Jeremy said makes a lot of sense, and hopefully the plan accounts for those habitat types.
So Paul mentioned, you might have different plant communities within this fictitious landscape that would dictate you might do slightly different things. I would add that there can also be regional differences in how plant communities are going to respond to fire. So like the research we've done here in Montana is suggesting that like even when there is some cheatgrass present on a landscape at 10% cover or less, we haven't seen an increase in annual grasses, for example, cheatgrass, after the fire. So there could be some regional differences. Northern Rockies, western side of the Great Plains compared to the Great Basin or Snake River plains. So like my approach would be if this scenario was in central Montana, right? Smack dab center of the state, southwestern Montana. Most of these fires occur late summer, right? Early fall. I'd probably give myself time the next season to see how the vegetation is returning. And just give yourself a year before you would start changing your management priorities. The other thing I will say is if there was any firefighting activities done in association with this fire, like a fire break was put in, a dozer line, that's where I would focus my attention. That double disturbance, the fire and the soil disturbance caused by putting in a dozer line, that's probably where you're going to see the biggest threat of annual grasses. And that's where I would look first and maybe be prepared to do some herbicide and seeding treatments.
Fire has been heavily overemphasized as a driver of state change for invasive grasses. Yes, it aggravates the problem, but really what the mechanism behind this change that's happening is much bigger than just fire, grazing, or disturbance. We're seeing sites transition without any real prior severe disturbance. And what we think's happening is that at the level of like perennial grasses and annual grasses, a mature perennial grass can outcompete a invasive grass. The problem is in the reproduction stage of our perennials where seedlings are having a tough time competing against invasive grasses that take all the moisture and nutrients. So this stuff is playing out long before fires ever occur. So my point to you is think about that ecology. That's really where we're trying to target our lever points and push these communities in a right direction well before fires ever happen.
I think there's this common misconception that you have a fire and everything's immediately cheatgrass. The pattern, this ties back to Jane's sort of hide and watch approach. The pattern, and this is fairly documented across the West, not just in kind of the Great Plains transition, is that there's a lag after a fire before cheatgrass ramps back up to where it was before a fire. Sometimes it exceeds where it was before a fire. But in a lot of cases, like Jane was saying, as you move east, it doesn't. If it was high before a fire, it may go back up to where it was afterward. So you've got some time. And there was a question, I think, somewhere about how does the litter maintenance thing and cheatgrass ramping up after a fire jive? Like how can you reconcile those two things? What we know about the cheatgrass population after a fire is that it really takes advantage of density dependent reproduction. So your density may be way lower across that burned landscape, but the plants that do establish and survive to reproductive age get access to a whole bunch of resources. And so you might have one like giant, robust, behemoth cheatgrass plant that's kicking out all kind of seeds. And so once that begins and you start to see an uptick following the fire, that population can rebound very quickly just from an exponential growth standpoint. And so, yes, there is a lag, and that initial lag is partly related to mortality of seeds that were produced in the year of the fire, and maybe some seeds that are in the upper part of that thatch. It's probably also driven by that reduction in litter layer that happens immediately after a fire. And once those plants are able to start reproducing again, then it can rebound quickly back up, maybe to where it was before, or maybe beyond that, depending on where we are. So I wanted to try to circle back around and make some of those loops. Now, Jane.